Last week we started discussing a metric of AI adequacy proposed by Elon Musk, which he defined as the density of intelligence per gigabyte of model memory. We pointed out that where the numerator of this ratio is concerned, there is a lack of consensus on the definition of intelligence that can be readily translated into a theoretically valid measurement instrument. What the psychologists in the 20th century and the AI researchers after them did was to turn the problem on its head. Define a measure, say an IQ test or some other logical reasoning or coding problem set, and then use the score on that set as an operational definition of intelligence. This amounts to hijacking this scientific concept by an arbitrary metric, basically saying that an intelligent person is simply a person with high IQ. Here is an example of what it looks like to an independent observer. Imagine a world very much like ours, but with only one difference, that Isaac Newton did not invent the theory of universal gravitation. By some accident, the apple has already fallen by the time Sir Isaac came to sit under the tree. As a result, in this imaginary world, we do not have a good theoretical definition of the weight of an object, but intuitively we all know what it is from early childhood. We can tell the difference between the things that are heavy and the things that are light, pretty much like anyone can say what is intelligent and what isn't when they see it. Now imagine at some point someone noticed that if you attach an object to one end of a spring and hold the other end up, the spring stretches out. When you attach a heavier object, the spring stretches more. So we decided to define the weight of an object as the stretch of the spring. Just like we say an intelligent person is the one who has high IQ, we now say that a heavy object is the one that makes a large stretch. Now, the next problem we encountered was that different springs stretch differently, so we needed to come up with a standardized spring, very much like a standardized IQ test, so that we could compare the weight of different objects. And then, sooner or later, we realized that some objects we want to weigh are so heavy that the standardized spring simply breaks. Incidentally, we realize that heavy objects may actually be quite useful. If attached to a pulley, for example, they can lift other objects and do various other useful things. This unleashed a frenzy of investment and innovation, because the independent weight labs in the Granite Valley started making heavier and heavier objects. They would publish their benchmark tests measuring their heavy objects with different new springs that were being invented, comparing how far they can stretch different new springs. Amid general excitement in the Granite Valley, the head of one of the weight labs, Maria Odomei, said that in 2026, 90% of the heavy lifting will be done by heavy objects, not by human heavy lifters. And then politicians realized that very heavy objects can pose threats to national security, and we need to make sure that China does not build an object that is heavier than our best foundational heavy objects. Then the head of another lab, Al Saltman, said that the ultimate goal of this whole endeavor is to build a general heavy object that will lift all other objects, and even more investment is needed so that we build this general heavy object earlier than China. Pundits would say, wait a second, how can we build a general heavy object if we cannot agree on what heavy fundamentally is? But by this time people would simply stare at them and say, don't you know that heavy is stretch? A simple operational definition. What else do you want? At that point, a great industrialist, Elon Musk, who was late to the general heavy objects game and was playing catch-up, argued that some objects are heavy not because they're genuinely heavy, but because they're simply very large, and so he proposed to measure the density of the object as its stretch relative to its size. But then the pundits would argue back that the difference in the springs that we use to weigh the foundational heavy objects can be directly attributed to the difference in the density of the material that the springs are made of. What is the density of that material? Well, it's stretch over size. But because the numerator of the density of the spring is the stretch that this spring produces in another spring, we have a circular definition which is, well, absurd. Such is the problem that we are dealing with when we are trying to define the intelligence density without having a principled, theoretically independent rather than operational definition of intelligence that can be translated into an equally independent, non-circular measurement protocol. In the world of physics, a foundational definition of the inertial mass of an object and the Newton's theory of universal gravitation allow us to define the weight in terms of the force of gravity that pulls a heavy object down and stretches the spring in the process. This theoretically principled definition of inertial mass also allows us to measure the same weight with different springs that produce different stretch, something that we still cannot do with intelligence. We can observe the fact that GPT 5.2 thinking stretches ARC-AGI to 52.9% and FrontierMath 40.3%, but we cannot tie these two stretch measurements back to a single theoretically robust concept of intelligence. But it does not mean that this is impossible in principle. How? We will start unpacking in the next episode. With this, until next Monday, my friends, I am Alex Chaduk, and this is AGI.